Good evening. A warm welcome to you all in this beautiful theatre of Kunstmin in Dordrecht. Thank you for joining us this evening for a very interesting program in which artist Edward Clydesdale Thomson is being interviewed by Anke Bangma, director of Tent in Rotterdam, on behalf of the amazing project of Rivier, boat, Stad. My name is Niels van Beek. I am a curator of art projects in the public domain at Taak in Amsterdam. And we have been asked to come up with a proposal for a project on behalf of the city of Dordrecht and the museum, the Dordrechts Museum. Let me show you where the project is taking place. It's actually at the Hofkwartier. It's a part of the inner city of Dordrecht. And on the map here, you can see on the lower right side the Dordrechts Museum. And when you look up on the left upper side, it's the Hof van Nederland. It's the historical museum. It's also the place actually where the Republic, the Dutch Republic, in the late 16th century came about. The assignment was actually to make a connection through this Hofkwartier area between the two museums. There's no real linear route between the two. The idea was that people would stroll and find their way through this area of the Hofkwartier. As a curator, we came up with a proposal in which we investigated the possibilities of art in this particular area. And we have asked 3 artists to come up with a proposal. And the proposal by Edward Clydesdale Thomson was chosen anonymously, I have to say, because it's really amazing. And I hope you will be convinced by that as well. And I wish you a lot of fun hearing about this in the interview by Edward and Anke.
Edward, nice to have you here. At the heart of your project, your proposal for Dordrecht is a boat. How did you come to this idea of a boat for Dordrecht?
Probably because I first came to Dordrecht by boat. I live in Rotterdam, and while Rotterdam is a wonderful city to live in, I've lived there since 2006, when people come to visit you, it's not the most exciting tourist city. And so one of the places I would often come is Dordrecht, and I would take the water bus here. So over the years, this idea of arriving by boat to Dordrecht has been very much a part of my thinking about the city. At the same time, all of the work I make, I try to situate in its context. So the question of location, the question of site, are really important narrative and gestural implications in how I develop a work. And so when I was first asked to consider the proposal that Niels has just explained, I began to try to look into the history of the city, trying to find little scraps, little snippets that I might start to work into a project. I'm going to show some slides. Some of the first images and things that I was looking at were old maps of the city. Or these were the first things that I saw that really started to talk to me. After the Elizabeth flood, Dordrecht, for example, had become an island. This was quite a a different situation than it is today, and it also spoke to me about this island city. But it was really this map that was one of the first key sort of triggers when I read it, that the city was established between the Meerwaard and the Dubbel, two larger rivers, along the Turedrit. It was a narrow waterway which connected the two. It was a shortcut from one river to another, along which they would drag the boats as a way to speed up the passage. So this was the first thing. So the question of the city, the rivers, then the commission is of course by the Dordrechts Museum.
Yes.
So I visited the museum, and an amazing narrative of in the paintings that in the permanent collection, they really speak to this history of Dordrecht as a maritime city, as a city that has been connected with the water, with shipbuilding. Then looking in the image archives, I came across this particular image, which is of the Lustig Endstraat, which is one of the streets in the Hofkwartier where the area was, during the flood in '53, where they were literally sailing through the streets. And this image of Dordrecht as a city that is intrinsically interwoven with the binnenvaart, with the interior waterways, with life on the water, with the shipbuilding, everything about the city, both in its establishment, in its development, and even today, seemed completely interwoven with the binnenvaart, and that was the inspiration for our boat.
You mentioned, and we can also see that the boats here were drawn. Why was that?
Well, along canals, because you might not be able to sail because of the wind, or the wind direction. The waterways were often too, let's say, too shallow. Things needed to be drawn across. There can be many reasons why a boat might need to be pulled.
But it's an image that stuck, right?
It's an image, absolutely, that stuck.
We'll come back to that.
It should also, my middle name is Clydesdale, and Clydesdale horses in the UK also used to be used to drag boats. So there's an older connection too.
Right. You said that there's the boat, but there's also the interest in a landscape that is defined by waterways, right? And landscape is a long-standing interest in your work. In Niels' introduction, we kind of heard that the task was to connect space within the city, symbolically by relating to the history of the landscape, but also physically by literally trying to make an artistic gesture that sort of could encompass the landscape. Now, both landscape as a theme and landscape as something to work with also have a history in your own work. You've been working with this for quite a while. So before we delve further into the project for Dordrecht, you're going to guide us through two older projects where some of these questions were already at stake. The first project we're going to look at is Tuin van Torop. Before we watch a clip about this project, can you introduce what the commission was there?
Well, it was a housing block in Amsterdam, which was being built, and the company that was building it wanted to commission an artist to create a garden in the interior courtyard and an exterior terrace. It's rented accommodation, they wanted an artist to come in at an early stage in the project to be able to have the artwork almost like a sort of a Gesamtkunstwerk as part of the building.
Right.
Yeah.
And so here too you made something for people that were going to live with an artwork, and the clip you're going to show us is addressed to them, right?
This was a clip that I made as an invitation for them to come to the opening of the artwork, basically. So there's a letter that I wrote, which was actually posted to each of the people that were now living or just moving into the flat at the time.
Okay, shall we have a look at Tuin van Torop?
Let's have a look.
Dear new resident of the Port van Torop, I'm curious how you're settling into your new apartment. It's a building I've spent the last 2 years living with, first in drawings and models, and then as a construction site as the structure rose. 2 years ago I started working on an artwork that was to encompass the 2 public spaces of the building into one artistic gesture. Right from the very start I was aiming of giving the courtyard and the terrace of the Poort van Stad a sense of being a landscape rather than an urban space or a garden. I find something very contemplative, perhaps even restorative, about being out of the urban environment, in a space whose scale is beyond immediate comprehension. I find being in a landscape gives me space to think. It's this idea of getting away to a place where you could think even for a moment that I wanted to try and create. In the same way that looking out across an ocean or surrounded by an expansive forest might allow a different mental state. The 2 landscapes I chose to evoke for me both have this quality. These 2 connected areas were to be distinct from each other in atmosphere. Both are abstracted or romanticized landscapes. Inside, a mountain landscape. On the terrace, a post-industrial grassy lowland. For me, this artwork unfolds precisely in the shift of perception that the opposition of these 2 different landscapes creates. With the act of replacing aspects of 2 landscapes within an urban context, I intend to promote a question of how should we live with nature today. Does it, or did it ever exist somewhere in a form unmodified by human activity? Or is this concept of human and the world as separate entities touching across a divide between pure and corrupt, or unconscious and conscious, a historical fantasy? As urban modernization developed throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, so has its aesthetic counterpoint, the idea of a wild and untamed nature. It's precisely this dialectic between these 3 environments I'm trying to contrast: the modern urban, the wilderness, and the leftover industrial turned back to nature. The project of the 19th and 20th century modernity portrayed nature as both an authentic wilderness and an exploitable resource in equal measure. Bringing together elements of these seemingly separate realms, I'm attempting to collapse the multiple viewpoints with which contemporary society views nature. The 4 sculptural works on the terrace are intended to oscillate between object and subject, nature and culture, image and material, and in so doing bring together these separate fields. Through giving the works commonplace first names Lars, Bengt, Mikael and Jeanette, each sculpture is attributed with an individual personality and a sense of subjectivity. Standing like characters, they silently narrate this work's reflection on the constructed notions of the natural and the urban, the human and the industrial.
So for Amsterdam, for this housing complex, you sculpted a garden, you sculpted a landscape, and at the same time there's something really theatrical about this work. Do you have an interest in that theatricality?
Why do you think it's theatrical?
Well, because in the terrace, the different sculptures that you place there, it's almost as if they're kind of taking the stage to try to narrate something.
Yeah. Well, yes. The sculptures have a long they have a long history in the narratives that I tried to embed in the material and the objects that I was working with. So they come from a period of research I was doing in Sweden, where I was looking at the Swedish forest, and the names of the sculptures are a homage to different characters that I met during this research. Nina is an artist, Lars is a researcher, Bengt is a researcher, Jeanette is a chemist, and these are all different people whose lives are in many ways determined by the forest, and they study the forest and they research the forest. And I was following them. And one of the frustrations I later had with this piece was that there were so many tales, so many spoken, let's say, narratives that I tried to embed into the actual sculptures, that they were still echoing in my head, that I did turn it into a play later, where the characters did come to life. So there is an inherent voice which I wanted to get out, but whether it came out in the sculptures or whether it came out later is a different question.
Oh, but it's nice to know that in a way the works emanate from long field research, encounters with different people, what the knowledge they share with you, the kind of sensitivity to different approaches, in this case to landscape, that all sort of becomes part of this collage that these works then are in the end, and they inhabit this landscape you created. It's nice. What you did here, of course, was that you were kind of turning an urban building site into a landscape. But what you're doing in Dordrecht, and what you also have done in a previous project, is that you're actually working with an existing setting, which is already full of histories that are either very apparent or more latent, with stories, with materialities, etc. With working from a landscape in a way where you can excavate and activate elements that are already there. Maybe it's nice to illustrate that with another project you did in Amsterdam in kind of a very different setting, an old a country estate that still remains there from the 18th century, I believe, Huis Frankendael.
Yeah, slightly earlier, but yeah, it was a Buitenplaats, so it was a kind of country holiday house for someone who had their main home on the, I believe, the Herengracht, or one of these places. And it's a building which it was now, of course, in quite a central location in Amsterdam, as Amsterdam has grown, and it's very much part of the, let's say, the leisure economy of Amsterdam. You have the Huis Frankendael, the Park Frankendael, and you have a Mergelbach, a restaurant there, and it's very much a part of the. People get married there. People have baby showers there. People have meetings. You can rent it for office, and they have an art program at the same time. The Frankendael Foundation. In fact, the art program is, in a way, existential to the exploitation of the building. When it was turned from being a domestic house, when it was bought by the city and turned into a place for everyone, a cultural place, the proposal that was made involved a combination of renting out rooms for people to be able to get married, a restaurant, and an art program. And the art program was always a part of that. And it was through the art program I was invited to work there. And a lot of my previous work had, because of my interest, let's say, in landscape and in gardens, I had been invited previously to work in a lot of quite formal, quite bourgeois locations. So when the invitation to do a show at the Frankendael came up, it was something I was very wary of, because in many cases the context in which you show can overpower the work, or can frame it in a way that you don't like. So Joram Kraveld, who had invited me there and was on the board at the time, and I got into a long discussion, and we brought in fact, Niels, who spoke earlier, and we came up with the idea of trying to find a different way of working there.
So you very much wanted to think about how to create the conditions to work in a layered context like that. I
didn't want to do a show. I had just done a massive show in Sweden, and it was very frustrating. I felt like it mirrored a very throwaway economy, in that you make a lot of work, you put it on show, and then this kind of great nothing comes back, as everything is embedded into it, but there's no I see the work at the opening, I see it when it goes back to my storage, and then that's sort of it. It sort of dies a death. And as I said before, there's so many stories, so many much embedded knowledge into it. And I felt like I wanted to try and find a different way of working, a way of working that was not so much about a throwaway economy.
Can you share some key examples
I
of
certainly can.
how you work there?
So, well, the first thing I did was to try to find a place to work from. So we negotiated that I could work there for 2 years, and one of the first things I did was I built a greenhouse as a studio. So here you see me and Conrad, who was a former student of mine, who was working for me as an assistant at the time, and we are. Well, I asked. There was an empty part of the garden which had a chicken coop in it, but there was no chickens in it. And so I asked, well, why are there no chickens? And they said, well, health and safety, we're not allowed to have chickens anymore. So, well, okay, if you're not allowed to have chickens, can I have that part of the garden? And they said, yeah, sure, why not? So I proposed to them that I build a shed and a greenhouse. So really one of the first things that we did there was to really establish a place to work from. And here you see it's below these 2 yew trees, and it's a greenhouse and a shed, and it turns the corner there. And it was a place, it was a studio, it was a place to work from.
A way to embed yourself in this setting.
Yeah, a way to really kind of dig myself in. We deliberately used a type of foundation that it lightly touches the ground. They're called ground screws, so we didn't actually make foundations as such, but also because we're directly under the trees. But it was absolutely a way to try and embed myself here. And, you know, once you've got a house, well, what do you just start doing? There were a lot of things in the garden which needed fixing, that needed maintaining. One of the first things I came across was this pond, which, like an eye, is the center of the garden. And as you can see, one of the poles is falling over. They had put a fence there to stop children falling into the pond, and it didn't look particularly effective. I went to the Amsterdam Zoo. There were a lot of animals, representations of animals already in the garden, and so I decided I'd visit the zoo to try to think a little bit more about, well, what could this mean? And in Amsterdam, there's a lot of herons. They're everywhere. In the zoo, they seem to make a kind of a chain. I saw them lining up. They were almost making a line that was difficult to cross. And this started to think, wow, the herons are almost like a fence, and where are they looking? So what is an animal doing in this sculpture? I started to think about this. So I decided to make a fence that was made out of herons. I spent a long time trying to cast a heron. It's very difficult to cast herons because of the feathers, and because you take away the feathers, there's not much body left. So I failed, I think, 3 times in casting a heron, and in the end I decided to use ones I could just buy that were for the garden. And then I cast fish and crab claws, and I turned the crab claws in on each other, and they became the links in the chain. So the crab is biting the fish, and the fish is bitten by the herons. So it's a kind of a playful work. It's a piece of restoration. Now you see in the middle of the formal garden, the pond, and it's a work that I made really with the children in mind, with the idea of making a work that people will find quite fun and quite light-hearted.
And at the same time, a way of caring for the place.
Yeah.
What else did you do there?
Well, I wrote a lot of letters. So my presence was, as you know, in my shed and in the small pieces of alterations and repairs that I would do. But what I found was a lot of people would come and visit me, and also the foundation itself. They had a newsletter. And so they were asking for updates for the newsletter about, well, what is Edward doing here? And that inspired me to start writing a diary. And so every month I would write a letter, and this letter would become part of an ongoing tour. So every time people would come and visit, and lots of people came to visit, I would give them a tour around, and I would read these letters. Here I'm reading a letter in front of a sculpture of Orpheus, where I'm reflecting on his lonely position there in the garden, and whether or not I could make a companion piece for him, which I eventually did.
Right.
Here I'm reading a letter written about the leopard on the back of this sculpture, which is the leopard's eyes are looking back through the house towards the pond. So the letters are situated in a context, and they also speak to what is around you at that time.
So, and the letters are also a way to sort of create an intimate relationship to what is around you, but also to the visitors. Now, collaboration was also a crucial part of your way of working there.
Yes, both with the people I was working with. So I was working with Conrad, who was I suppose doing an assistant or an intern, former student of mine, and then with Lucas Messner, again a similar situation, and also with Lisa. So there were various former students of mine who would work with me there in a kind of internship capacity. And then I invited a lot of other artists in to do either events or talks or collaborations.
Can you give one example?
Well, this is the uniform that I had made. Again, it's to do with the visibility, let's say, of who I am and what am I doing there. Of course, everybody else, all the staff from the Frankendouw Foundation, or the House Frankendouw, have a uniform. And so I thought, well, it could be interesting if I had a uniform, but what would that uniform look like? Jason Coburn, a British artist living in Rotterdam, has an interest in pattern and an interest in denim. And we have in the past corresponded a lot about these various topics. And I thought he would be a really interesting artist to collaborate with. And so I asked him, or commissioned him, let's say, to design a uniform for me. And Jason, embracing perhaps some of the narrative of what I was doing there, he asked that the uniform not be delivered all at once, but be delivered in stages. So what we did was, or what he did was, he would, every few months, I would get a new garment. It was really like Christmas. It just kept on coming. He would turn up at my studio with something new, a new pair of socks for me to wear, or a new pair of gloves. And the garments developed and aged over time. Like in the slide before here, you see two, what are they called, aprons, specific aprons he'd made in denim, one of which I continue to wear. The second of them, we decided to bury, or he decided we would bury, because he wanted it to be buried for a year, and then we would dig it up after 1 year, and then I would continue to wear it. We did this, and tragically, or not tragically, when we dug it up, it had completely disappeared.
Maybe not a complete surprise? Or?
Maybe not a complete surprise. We had not expected to have completely gone. We buried a number of garments, and one of them that did survive, I say survive, it barely survived, was one of the T-shirts, because it had a small amount of man-made fiber in it, and everything else had disappeared apart from the man-made fiber, which was perfectly intact.
Right.
And here you see this. Here you see a slide of the complete uniform. And during an exhibition at the end, this is the boardroom. It's the room they rent out. We decided to hang the uniform there during the boardroom, and every day I would have to go and interrupt them to take my clothes, to go and get changed and put them back again. So it was my wardrobe for that time.
So the project took about 2 years, right? So it encompassed much more than we can share in this short time frame. But what I really like about this proposal that Jason Coburn made for you is that the factor of time became very visible in the work itself. Burying it, leaving it a year, digging it up, the signs of time and the seasons and literally the soil, the materiality that you were working with becoming present. So for me, it's very nice that you end with this because it's very symbolic, I think, for the whole project and for the way of working, which is that you don't study a place and then come up with one sculpture that becomes a monument in the center, but that actually what you create is something like an evolving artwork that evolves and unfolds both in space and in time. And that's maybe a nice bridge back to our project Rivier, Stad. Because there too, we started with a boat, but it's not just about the boat. The boat becomes a vessel for something larger, right?
That's right. It does, and this connects really to the main artistic challenge, which was for me how to create an artwork that's, let's say, for lack of a better word, large enough to encompass this urban area between the two museums. A work which could hold that together, so to hold that space as an artistic gesture without compromising and without riding kind of roughshod over all of the other histories that are there. So it's an area that is full of beautiful architecture. It's an area that is rich in history, and how to create a work that can live within that. This was the main artistic challenge for me. But if you remember the last slide that we looked at of the boat being pulled by the father and son along the canal, that of course the image of a boat being pulled is incredibly strong. It lives in your mind. Fitzcarraldo lives in your mind. The Vikings live on through the image of pulling and lifting and dragging boats. The journeys of Arctic and Antarctic explorers having to survive in upturned boats or drag boats across ice for weeks on end talks to the idea of pulling a boat as something that is or a boat on land or a boat out of water, as an image that is strong, an image that is possible to remember and to hold a larger narrative together. The whole story of Fitzcarraldo, an interesting, complex story, is held together by the image of this boat being pulled over this mountain. This was really resonating with this maritime history for Dordrecht that I had. At the same time, these are images of Fife, the area in Scotland that I'm from. These are old harbours. These are scars in the landscape left from late medieval harbours. This is a bull stone. This is a stone where brutally they would tie bulls to over centuries and torture them. And over the time, it gets embedded, the traces of this history get embedded into it. So the trace of a history as a scar, but not as a scar that is something negative, but something where something can grow from. This is for me, resonates with this narrative that I picked up at the beginning, this origin narrative for Dordrecht, where the city grew along the Dordrecht, between the Meerbaard and the Dubbel,
Yes.
where these boats were pulled, and the pulling of this boat as a marking over time, creating a trace, and over time that trace becoming something where something can grow from. This, to me, was the narrative story that inspired this whole project.
So that's at the heart of the actual proposition that you made
Yeah.
for Dordrecht, because it's not just about building a boat, but then what will happen?
Well, the boat will be pulled from one museum to another. But where will it be pooled? How do you get from one museum to another? This drawing encompasses the whole area that we are talking about, the area of the Hofkwartier, where I was asked to make the commission for. On the lower right, you have the museum. On the top left, you have the Hof van Nederland. And between the two, you have a number of narrow medieval streets. This sketch is an analysis of the sight lines into that. This sketch is picking out certain positions along that route, whereby if you position something, it would be strategically positioned so that you could see it from all of these sight lines in. And using this very simple analysis, I decided on the route that we would drag this boat. So we turn out of the Museumstraat, we go down the Lustig-Endstraat, past the park, through the Cloister Garden, and we end up at the Hof. It's just a few hundred meters, but it traverses a very, let's say, a narrow, old structure. And here what you see is my very first sketches of, well, okay, so I want to pull a boat from this museum to that museum.
What would that look like?
What would that look like?
Show us.
Well, it would have to smash its way through the museum fence, first of all, because it has to get out of the courtyard. The boat would be, or the ship would be too narrow or too long to make its way round off the Museumstraat into the Lustig-Endstraat, so it might have to be lifted up in the air. As it moved down that street, it would be too wide, so it would scratch along the sides of the building, tracing its travels. It might have to go on its side to go through the underpass over to the cloister town. So these are really the very first sketches of what this journey would be like. I started to think of the boat almost like a piece of charcoal, drawing a line through the city from one museum to another. And so to illustrate that, or to think about that, I made some boats, and I bought some wooden boats, and I burnt them in a low oxygen environment to turn them into charcoal.
To make sketches of what could possibly happen.
Yeah, because I wanted to use a charcoal boat to make a sketch of what this would look like. So, this is the kind of the key concept, is really that this ship, which passes through these streets, draws a line from one museum to another, like a charcoal pencil drawing through the city.
You have an animation of what it would look like as well, right?
I do. We will play that right now. And this is an animation. Well, this is not actually an animation. That's the wrong term.
Simulation.
This is a simulation. This is a simulation that I made for the sketch design phase. So right at the beginning of the project, and I didn't know much actually about simulation at the time, but I know a lot about simulation, which we'll come back to later. But Petros, who makes this for me and now works for me, he's an expert in simulation, and what it means is that we're working with real forces. You're not animating a brake, you're simulating the brake, but we'll come back to that later. So here you see the boat coming down the Lustig-Endstraat, lifting up, as I said before, to make it round the corner. You see, this is the kind of probably the most violent part of the journey, where the boat is on its side, and it can't quite make it from one side to the other, and it really breaks in two as it crosses over into the cloister town. Here we see this is the grassy field in the center of the cloister town, and we see the boat ripping up the soil as it's dragged over the grass. And making this simulation is really about trying to imagine and trying to visualize the key, let's say the key element of the project which is this event, which is the dragging of the boat from one place to another. And here we're passing the narrowest part of the journey, where the smallest fragment of boat, the end piece, turns the corner into the Hof van Nederland.
So you're really sculpting an experience here that kind of unfolds in time as well. So this is what will happen. Do you know about when this will happen?
The plan is June.
June next year.
End of June.
But this is not where you are now. Where are you now in this project?
Well, now we are working in the Biesboshal, and we are about 2 months into the build of the boat. Shall we have a little look at a video of that?
Yes, please. Amazing. I've seen it live, so this is, to stand next to it in process is yet something else. And building a historical chalk is not something that you can just do as a sort of textbook exercise, right? This is something that really fascinates me. How do you gain the expertise to first build a historical chalk, then to turn such a giant piece into a giant piece of charcoal, then to carry it through the streets, and then to know how to let it break in exactly the right pieces at the right places, as you had imagined it in all the imagery we saw before. How do you build the expertise to do this?
Yeah, I have no idea. Or I had no idea. I know now. But I knew where to look. The first question is really, how do you build a team through which you can do this? Because it's impossible to do that alone. So the first thing I did was I called Ivana Dubbers, and I asked if she wanted to be a studio manager and a project manager, because I knew I needed somebody on my team who could help realize this. Then the next question is, well, how do you build a boat? And how do you build a historic boat? We got in the car. Well, first we made a lot of research. Then we got in the car and we drove to Xanten in Germany, where we met with a boat builder, Kees Sars, who specializes in reconstructing historic boats. In his case, at the moment, he's reconstructing Roman vessels that used to sail in the area. And he taught us, or told us, in a very simple way, essentially what goes into building a boat. Mm. And I came away from that meeting, I remember saying this to Ivana in the car back, okay, that's good, now I'm confident we can build a boat. Because I felt like we, although there was, of course, there's so much we don't know, the principles were there. And Kees put us in touch with Wouter Schaak. And Wouter is a master boat builder. He was working in Rotterdam on the Delf for many years, a project which unfortunately just went bankrupt, a beautiful project. And through Wouter, we got in touch with Arjan and Onno, 2 more boat builders. and they're our, let's say, our boat building team, our master boat builders. They have the knowledge of the carpentry and the skills that go into building such a boat.
So at this point, it becomes really a collaborative project.
It becomes collaborative in that yeah, at that point, maybe even before, of course, bringing in Ivana and bringing in Petros for the simulations, but we'll come back to that. But certainly, and but then the question is really what kind of ship, what kind of boat do you want to build? What is relevant? Because there have been hundreds of different types of boat that have sailed in the area of Dordrecht. I knew from the get-go I wanted to work with a binnenvaartschip because of the let's say the social history of the binnenvaart. It's a very human history. It's a history of people living and growing up, families on these boats. But it's also a history that connects with the way that the growth of Holland and its landscape. So it comes back to this interest in landscape, because I remember years ago reading that in Holland was the first country that you would measure time by distance.
Oh, yeah.
And this was because of the binnenvaart, because the passage of boats were so regular between the cities that you could say it would take 6 hours to get from Amsterdam to Leiden and 8 to get to Utrecht and so forth. So the boats were really like a public transport network. It was cheap to ride on and you could move around, much in the same way as I had come to Dordrecht by boat. So this history of let's say the binnenvaart, almost like a public transport network, or certainly a social history. So I knew I wanted to be a binnenvaartschip, but that is also a large variety. So I went to the Maritime Museum in Rotterdam and I spoke with them there. And they advised me to start thinking about chalks. And a chalk is a generic term for a particular type of binnenvaarts boat or ship. And there are many. Each region has its own type of chalk. In this area here, the Zuid-Hollands Gaffelchalk is one of the kinds of chalk which sailed in the area, and an example of which can be found in the Binnenvaarts Museum here in Dordrecht. This was a boat that sunk near the Biesbos about 150 years ago.
Right.
About 10 years ago, it was raised from the seabed, and it can be found in the Biesbos Hall. The Biesbos Hall is also where we were given a place to work, where we were given, let's say, a studio, because I need a big space to build a boat. So we're building in this boat building hall.
So on the one hand, you're working with people who really can reactivate this historical craft of knowing about the wood, knowing about how to build a boat. And on the other hand, you needed the simulation in order to move towards actually being able to see how the boat would move through the space and where it could break. Can we have a look at that simulation as well?
Sure. I think there's one thing I'd like to say before we do that, and that it was always a movement between the two, because we needed the simulation to understand the movement of the boat and where it would break, but we needed the historical examples to understand the simulation, because the simulation is built brick by brick, let's say, bit of wood by bit of wood. They sit on top of each other, and the forces and the combination of forces mimics the reality of it. But to be able to build this accurate model, you need to know how such a boat is built. And that's where examples like the Jonge Jacob here in the Binnenvaarts Museum, or various people that actually own model boats that were built at that time, in that period, we basically reverse engineered this to be able to come up with a set of construction drawings which would allow us to build the boat. This is the actual lines. This is not my drawing. This is from a contemporary drawing of a boat. But this is the amount of information we found in the drawings, not enough to build an accurate simulation from. And this is then the simulation that Petros made. And here you see our chalk. You see our chalk in an accurate scale, and you see it moving down the museum Stad. In a simulation, as you give an object a momentum. You give it a force, and how it reacts will depend on the strength of that force and the strength of the materials. So here you see the rudder falling off because of the impact it had as it struck the facade of the museum. Here you see the side of the boat breaking apart as it hits the side of the lustig Endstraat. And for us, more than a communication tool, the simulation is a way in which we can accurately predict where the breaks would happen in a boat if it passed these narrow streets with great force. And these are all, and this knowledge then we use to build in very particular structural failures into our boat so that it will fall apart in these places without actually having to damage the architecture, to damage the street.
We will talk towards the end of our conversation about the remains, the bits that break off. But what you also can really see in this simulation is, of course, how by doing something impossible, squeezing a boat or dragging a boat eventually through a space where it cannot fit, you're touching on, intruding upon all these spaces that you pass, right? People live there, people use those spaces. It will leave marks, but it also really triggers the question, how on earth do you bring people aboard such a project? Politicians, the mayor, but also people living there, which will have a boat scraping the facade of the building that they're living in.
Yeah, I mean, this is a project that we want the event, so this will all happen in one day. In one day we will pull it from one place to another. And we want that to capture the imagination. And we want that to be something that people remember. And to do that, the event has to unfold, of course, but we have to start to build up an affinity with the boat. This shouldn't just be any boat. This is a boat that was built in Dordrecht. This is a boat that volunteers are working on. Many people are working on. We want to build up these stories throughout the project. And part of that process is, of course, communicating about the project all the way through. So we've met with the Welstands Committee. We've met with the Monuments Org. We've met with the Wethouder for Culture. We've met with all of the Wethouders. We've met with the mayor. We've met with the owners of the buildings. We've met with the housing corporations that own the buildings. We've met with all kinds of people, all kinds of stakeholders who are a part of this process, who we want to be a part of this process anyway, who we want to
partly actively as well, because how are you going to find the people that are going to be actually pulling this boat?
Yeah.
Because it looks to immaculately move by itself in this simulation, but that's not what it's going to be like.
Suspiciously missing the people are in this.
Exactly.
Yes. It's going to take hundreds of people to move it. It's going to be, it's going to be a massive collective effort to be able to achieve this. So we need all kinds of groups to get involved. Manuela, our community builder, is trying to gather as many people together in this task. But it's also it's both a practical necessity. We need all these people, but the project also needs it on a more existential level. Because these are the people that will hold the memory. Let's say they'll hold the narrative of what the project was. And while indeed there is a physical remains, traces of the project, it is the knowledge within this embedded in this memory, in this collective memory. I was a part of this impossible thing.
So it also becomes a co-ownership and a shared care of this project.
That is what I would love to happen, and that's what we're trying to make happen.
We have 2 minutes left for you to share with us a little bit about what these eventual remains of the project would be.
Well, as we talked about earlier, charcoal. So the boat is like a charcoal pencil. The boat will be dragged. The boat will be burnt, be charred black, like you see us charring a boat here.
It's quite a dramatic event in itself, to build a boat and then to burn it.
It's one of the things that a lot of people are they find quite, let's say, they take a breath. And I think by the
They
time
ask
we
why.
finish,
Yeah.
yes, I think by the
Yeah.
time we finish building the boat, we will also probably take a breath. But no, it's a very important part of the translation process to turn it from, rather than being, let's say, a reconstruction of a boat, into something else. It's a process of transformation, and it will undergo another process of transformation. The fragments of boat, the leftovers, will be cast, and they will come back in the streets along the journey, in the places where they broke off. So the traces of the boat's passage will be marked with these casts of broken boat, through which you will see the energy and the forces and the dragging and the moving. The most dramatic of which will probably be well, maybe not the most dramatic, but one of the most will probably be the moment which the ship breaks through the fence of the museum. And what we're going to do is we're going to first remove this section of fence and wall, and then we will rebuild it with a replica, which we will drag the boat through. We will then, working from the digital simulation we have, we're simulating every brick, every piece of mortar, and the traces of this boat. And at the same time, we will also measure the traces that were left from the actual boat passage. And we will put these two things together, and then we will rebuild a section of wall in which we're robotically carving the traces of the boat coming back through. So this you will see as let's say a break through the wall, while other aspects you will see like a cast fragment of the broken boat.
You can see why maybe I asked you earlier what your interest in theatricality was, because it's quite an intense drama that you will unfold here over the next year. Thank you very much for taking us through the different stages and the background of this project, and also reconnecting it with some of the earlier work you have done that maybe laid some of the groundwork for this big art, this big gesture that you're making here in Dordrecht. The last word is for Niels van Beek.
Thank you for watching. I wanted to say just a final thing, just to stress how extraordinary this project is, and also it fits so much in the new discourse of art in public space. When we were asked to do something at the Hofkwartier, you might have imagined an object coming in. But actually what we wanted to propose is that you would imagine a way of working. And I think during this talk, the way of working, the mode of working and thinking that Edward does with his team and with all the other people that he is collaborating with is the most crucial part. The city of Dordrecht, especially in the times that the CBK was still around, had already quite a strong tradition in art commissions, and they wanted to see if a different approach would lead to different output. So you could also say that there is kind of collection of these kind of projects in Dordrecht. Well, that has been a while, and actually this project might be a new beginning in which Dordrecht really stands out as a city for art in public domain. It's not site-specific, it's situation-specific. It just wants to embrace all the layers and all the complexities that are evoked by the project as well. And what is actually even more contemporary in regard to art in public space is that also what was mentioned in the talk is that it's so much about ownership. It's not the city that's deciding what art will represent the people in Dordrecht. Through this project, actually, we and Edward tries to enlarge this ownership so that people will have a history with the project, and also once the traces are still there, they will know and remember for years and years that they have been part of this. And actually, that's a very amazing thing that this can happen here in Dordrecht. So I hope everybody from Dordrecht will be proud and will all come and will all feel invited to become a co-owner of this project. There's a lot more to come until June, but also afterwards. So please stay posted. We have all kind of channels to follow the project. And to end an interesting night, I would also like to thank everybody who is here tonight with us. So the crew at Kunstmin, Edward Clydesdale Thomson and people from his studio, of course Anke Bangma who is here, and most of all also you at home watching this. So thank you very, very much.